Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what is now our second Ithaas discussion. If we haven't already been acquainted before, my name is Goman, and over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll be giving you a talk on a very important topic, one which, after overpopulation, probably represents the next big demographic challenge for India. We'll be talking about India's declining gender ratio, and more specifically about the decreasing number of women relative to men in Punjab. Now, this talk actually represents the webinar format of a talk that was delivered at the Indie Film Centre on the night of Friday, the 13th of November 2015 in Parramatta in Sydney. A big thank you to everyone who took their time out to attend that talk. Understandably, issues of timing and location meant that people were not able to attend, and for that reason, we at Ithaas have prepped a webinar to share the knowledge. Now, we've only got about 40 minutes to cover what is quite a large and significant topic, so you'll have to excuse me if I do move a little bit quickly. But there are plenty of resources and references which have been provided throughout the talk, which we can help you to access for further reading. Once again, the aim of this talk is not to cover everything and anything relevant to this topic, but just to give you an overview, to help you formulate some ideas in your own head so you can go away and read more about the issue using some of the references which have been provided. So with that, let's get started. Now, when we first sat down to try and tackle this topic, one of the hardest things that we found was starting. It was difficult to find a logical starting point to tackle such a complex topic. And it's made much more complex by the fact that the vast majority of the audience on the night, and I assume a significant proportion of our listeners through the internet, have at best a second-hand experience of the factors that we're about to talk about. Put very simply, many of us haven't lived in Punjab for very long. So I thought, what better way to start than with Punjab? I'm sure we've all been there. We've got fond pictures on our desktops. We love the food. We love our relatives, we love the camp, and everything that makes Punjab great. And all of this sentiment comes out in our songs and in our pride about our culture. But sometimes in this pride that we take in Punjab, in our identities, in our culture, we hide the fact that just below the surface linger some very serious social issues which need to be addressed. They need to be brought out into the open. Punjabis have a higher per capita rate of alcohol consumption than Russians. Somewhere between 30 to 50% of Punjab youth is addicted to drugs. Then, of course, there's this. Now, on the night, we had some great audience participation, and we posed these questions to people, but of course, it's a lot more difficult to do on webinars, so I'll just give you the answers. Per 1,000 males, Punjab's gender ratio has been declining for a few years constantly. It's now sitting at 895. It's actually not far off the lowest gender ratio in India. It's a title which is currently held by a state just to the south of Punjab, and it's that of Haryana. It's a long way from the highest gender ratio in India, which is actually held by a state in the south of India, which is often at the top of any marker of social progressiveness or social advancement, and that's that of Kerala. 1,084 females in the state of Kerala per 1,000 males. Altogether in India, there are 943 females per 1,000 males, and unfortunately for us, as students of social phenomena, India only undertakes a census every 10 years. So this data is from 2011. Now, you might be thinking 943 isn't actually all that bad. In fact, it is a lot better than many other countries. But this is where it gets interesting. The overall gender ratio actually includes women of all ages. Now, about 50% of women in India are aged below 24. It's a relatively young country. As a 23-year-old, I'm not saying that once you become over 24, you actually are old. But once you are over 24, it actually puts you into the older 50% of women in India. What this means is that the gender ratio doesn't give an accurate estimation of the attitude towards girl children at any one time. The figure of 943 probably lagged behind a few decades, and those decades are the decades where those women who are contributing to that gender ratio are born. And hopefully that makes sense. It can be a little bit confusing. But what all of this means is that in order to get a picture of the attitude towards the birth of female children at any one time, we need to look at the ratio in those who are young and born recently, because that will give us the most accurate contemporary picture. Now, when we break up the gender ratio like this, a worrying trend appears. Now, this is the gender ratio for India in the 0 to 6 years age group. So we can see there's been a consistent decline from about 976 females per 1,000 males in the 0 to 6 years age group down to 914 in 2011. Now, we could have taken this data a little bit further back prior to 1961, but unfortunately the census infrastructure was not as well developed around the time of independence. Now, if you think that that's concerning, let's get Punjab onto the same graph. There it is there. You'll notice that we don't even fit. Now, the astute observer listening to this talk would accuse me of sensationalism. Yes, of course, I did pick this scale, and I could have altered it to make Punjab fit on the graph. But I didn't, because I'm trying to make a point. Now, we have bounced more recently, but we lag behind the rest of the country by a long way, in the vicinity of about 70 females in the 0 to 6 years age group per 1,000 males. Of course, Punjab isn't homogeneous. Urban Punjab is very different from rural Punjab, and you would expect this to be reflected in their 0 to 6 years age group gender ratios as well. So let's start urban. Well, speaking of urban Punjab, just try to think about which city in Punjab is home to this famous structure. Of course, the answer is the clock tower in central Ludhiana. Now, if we look at the gender ratios between urban and rural Punjab in the 0 to 6 years age group, we'll actually find that they're quite similar. And this is something that is quite different to the rest of India, where the urban environment in India tends to have a gender ratio which is a little bit lower, or markedly lower, depending on where you are, than the rural environment. I think everyone's had enough of the statistics by now, and it's probably time to get an idea of exactly how far back this problem goes. And what the evidence suggests is that it's actually not a recent problem. In fact, as a result of a range of factors, it's been a part of Punjabi society for quite a long period of time. And admittedly, advances in technology have changed the way that it is now completed. The data that we look at, as with most things, comes from the writing of early British government officials in Punjab. One of the earliest records that we have on this is from the Commissioner of the Jalandhar Doab region following the defeat of the Sikh army. And in his writings, he makes note that he found that there were no girls in over 2,000 Bedouin families whom he came across in the area. The Bedouins later in British writings became known as the Uriman because of the high prevalence of the practice of infanticide among their families. Now, apart from the Bedouins, a number of other social groups, the Jats, the Kshattriyas, the Rajputs, regardless of which religion they followed, practiced infanticide, killing of the girl child after it was born, and so had quite dismal gender ratios. And because these groups actually formed the vast majority of the population of Punjab, Punjab's gender ratio itself was actually quite dismal at this time as well. We can see it floated around the 850 females per 1,000 males, and of course this is the overall gender ratio, not in the 0 to 6 years age group, or in some places it was actually much lower than the 850 mark. In the same writings, we actually learn a lot about how the practice of infanticide was carried out. Killing of the girl child was that common that it was considered to be a part of the traditional role of the midwife or the birthing assistant. And a description of a relatively common occurrence that would happen in villages and cities all over Punjab goes something like this. So, after the birth of an unwanted female child, the midwife would give the girl a few drops of sap from a poisonous plant called ork, put some wood in the baby's mouth, and give it a pony, a raw cotton which is used to spin a thread on a spinning wheel, in her hand, and then sing this ritual song which roughly translates to eat wood, spin the cotton, don't come back, and send your brother. She then put the infant into an earthen pot and buried it alive. Now, in an attempt to try and curb this act, and some argue to try and exert greater control over the politically influential groups in society, the British put in place an act outlawing the practice of infanticide in 1870. Of course, this became very difficult to police all over India, and in Punjab particularly, we don't really have stats on the rate of infanticide. So exactly what effect this act had on the levels of infanticide that were occurring in Punjab at this time, we don't know. Even if infanticide did this, it's well recorded that at this time, even if there was no deliberate design of hastening a girl's death, i.e. she would not be killed at birth, she would be less warmly clad, she would be less carefully rubbed with mustard oil as a prophylactic against cold and chills, she would be not so well fed as her brother might be, and she would be less likely to receive the medical care that she needs when she would be sick. And all of these factors will contribute to a higher infant mortality rate among children, and girl children particularly, all throughout India. Of course, we could say that this sort of discrimination actually continues today as well, but it's sort of out of the scope of this topic at this point, and we'll come to that at a later point, and I'll leave you to read more about this and to learn more about colonial attitudes towards infanticide. There's a fantastic paper here that I can recommend to you, and we can help you to access as well. So just to recap everything that we've covered up until now, we have a demographic problem. It's not something which is new, which suggests that it may be as a result of something ingrained in the way we do things and in our culture. We need to recognize what this is in order to fix this demographic problem. Now, as you all know, during the talks that we run, we do love to get some audience participation in these talks, and this is a goal which adds an emotional dimension to many of the stats that we're actually talking about. It's difficult to go through such a topic without having an emotional dimension because so much of what we're talking about is not explainable through logical and rational thought. At the talk itself, we had a volunteer read this out, but in this case, I might just read it out for you. Jad jammi sama pegan, parai aisi hai, saure kar vich kain begandi, jai aisi hai. Kehde kar diya tha tenu ki satkar dena, apne hisse di duniya mein dekhwar dena. And the English translation is also provided. Here as an extra question, just have a think about which famous Punjabi singer actually included these lines in one of their songs. And the answer, of course, is Gurdas Mann. Now back to the issue. So we know we have a complex demographic problem which extends back a number of decades to a number of centuries. Now, to try and propose causes of such a complex social phenomenon is difficult, but I've tried to give you an image of ideas proposed in this quite large-scale study from the Lancet. Now, these are things that we're going to cover in a little bit more detail, but right at the bottom are the broad social issues that run deep and influence attitudes towards women in Punjab. These issues include things such as dowry, religious practices, marriage customs, and declining fertility rates. And all of these attitudes feed into the way that girls are treated. The worst possible manifestation of this includes the intentional murder of female fetuses prior to birth, female feticide, killing newborn girls, female infanticide, and neglecting female children, not providing them the same opportunities for education, physical, and social achievement. Ultimately, all of these feed into the gender ratio. So I don't think it's a surprise to anybody listening when I say that the gender ratio is actually an outcome indicator. It's as a result of everything that comes before it. In order to try and address this, we need to address all of this. And in order to address all of this, we need to address all of this. And in order to address all of this, I assume we actually need to change all of Indian society, which is what is just below this. So it's not easy by any means. Let's start talking about some of these issues. Right at the bottom, let's talk about underlying causes. Dowry is one social disease that we all know about and it refuses to go away. If we have to define it, we can define dowry as, very broadly, as a transfer of wealth from the bride's family to the groom's family at the time of marriage. And unfortunately, I think we all know that somewhat shamefully it continues after marriage as well. It's a practice that's been well documented in India since the British Raj. What you may not know is that it's actually illegal in India to ask for dowry. The Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961 actually outlaws the practice of dowry, but you don't need me to tell you that what's written in law and what actually happens on the ground in India differ immensely. Now, the average value of dowry paid in weddings was last analysed in 1993. We don't really have any more up-to-date figures. But this analysis shows that the value of dowry at that point amounted to about 68% of the total household assets of the average bridal household in India. Now that value is about the same as 6 times the average annual income of rural bridal households. Of course, that's only one side of the picture. What happens when the dowry paid is not enough? Of course, this results in physical, emotional, and sexual abuse of the bride in her husband's house. And the worst possible reflection of this is women who actually die in dowry-related violence in India. Now, I want to pose this as a question to everyone who's listening today. Have a think about the number of women who die in dowry-related violence in India. Which of these figures is it closest to? Does it equate roughly to 1 every hour? Does it equate to 1 every day? 1 every week? Or 1 every month? Now, the last most accurate and most up-to-date figure that I could actually get for this was 8,233 dowry-related deaths in 2012. There are about 8,700 hours in a year. So, of course, this figure actually equates to 1 every hour. Just think about that for a moment. I'll be talking for roughly an hour in this presentation. What's even more concerning is exactly how many of these deaths actually go unreported. How many deaths are covered up by the families in an effort to try and save face, or when they're reported to the police, they're actually registered as a case under another cause of death rather than dowry-related death. Moving on to the next underlying cause, we all know that society, not just Punjab but all of northern India, is patrilineal. All assets are registered under the male's name and they're passed down through generations of males. It's also considered to be patrilocal. Much of the life of the married couple actually revolves around the parental household of the husband. The costs of such marriages are borne by the bride's family, and as we all know well, it's not just enough to have a wedding. Extravagance of these weddings, the number of helicopters one can hire, how many platters of kiwi fruit that can be served, how many mates you can bring in with shotguns, the different types of whiskey that you serve, all tie into your social standing. They influence what everybody thinks of you. And you don't need me to tell you that there might be something wrong with this system. But not only is there something wrong, the costs are increasing. In an effort to constantly outdo each other, weddings are becoming more and more flamboyant and expenses are blowing out. And the effect of all this is that illegal abortion clinics can actually advertise sex-selective abortion by pitching it against the potential cost of the marriage. And seeing signs like this is not unusual. It's better to spend 500 rupees now and have that sex-selective abortion that you are contemplating than to spend 5 lakh rupees later when it comes time for marriage. And of course, 5 lakh rupees is a very conservative estimate for a marriage in modern-day Punjab. Now, to add to all of these social ills, Punjab has undergone significant social change in the last 40 to 50 years. It's changed the nature of the economy and the workforce. And much of this is being reflected in this picture here. Now, have a think about what I might be referring to. I'm going to emphasize the greenness of the crop here. Of course, the answer to this is the Green Revolution. Punjab's economy currently is predominantly based on agriculture, and it's slightly different to the states of South India where there's greater economic diversification. Now, much of this came about in the 1960s during the Green Revolution. Farming became mechanized, yields increased, crop and food output multiplied to try and curtail fears of an impending famine in India. An overlooked effect of this often is that the mechanization of labour has freed up men in the household to pursue other income-generating activities. Women who would have in the past been able to gain employment and earn a small income in physical tasks are now unable to do so because either those tasks have become mechanized or they've been taken over by men who have been freed up through the mechanization of labour. This results in further marginalization of women in the household and reduces the earning potential of women in rural India and their ability to contribute and have a say. Most of you, if you're fortunate enough, may still have living grandparents, and you should talk to your grandmothers about picking cotton. It's a practice which is still completed by women in Punjab, but not as commonly as it once was. Of course, we can't talk about the Green Revolution without testing your knowledge of Punjabi crops. Now, out of these, let's have a think about which is the Punjabi name for cotton. Is it Ithaas, B. Mucky, C. Kapa, or D. Chona? And of course, the answer is C. Kapa. So Kapa, Narma, Rung, depending on where you are, depending on which variety of cotton is planted, are all names which are often used. Now, why we're even talking about this and why it's relevant to the talk is, of course, if you went to ask your grandmother about picking cotton, she wouldn't say that she would pick cotton. She'd say something along the lines of, and if your Punjabi is like mine, you might miss the significance of this statement with relevance to Punjab's gender ratio. Also have a think about what the rest of these crops are. It's handy knowledge to know. Now, we move on to another underlying cause, that of declining fertility rates in Punjab. Now, fertility rates throughout the state have actually declined significantly in the last few years. There comes with this a desire to try and reach the supposed ideal family, whatever that may be, earlier and through fewer children and with less natural chance. And the theory is that sex-selective abortion is actually being used to do this. Certainly, the evidence that we actually have suggests that a couple is more likely to pursue sex-selective abortion if they already have one or two girls. This sort of an idea is really captured in this comment from a lady who presented to an abortion clinic. In Punjab, everyone wants only 2 children these days. If the first one is a girl, then people go for tests to make sure that the next birth is that of a boy. The last underlying cause we'll be discussing is religion. And it's interesting here we need to be very careful when painting religious groups with a broad brush. Hinduism has certainly had a history of questionable practices, particularly in rural areas, and these are likely to have been driven by certain preachers. It's unlikely to be an embodiment of what's actually written in religious texts or what actually happens at the broader level. Things which come to mind would include the practice of sati, a quite barbaric practice outlawed in India under the British, and the last recorded case of which occurred in India in the 1970s in rural Gujarat. Sati, of course, involves the immolation or burning of a live wife on the funeral pyre of her husband who is recently deceased. In religious doctrines in Hinduism, only the son is considered to be sufficient to perform the death rites for parents and is fostered a preference for boys. Now, how all of this translates into a gender ratio is interesting. Now, let me ask you this. Which religious group out of these, in India, actually has maintained some of the lowest ratios of females to males and at last check continues to have the lowest ratio? Have a think about it. We've talked about Hinduism's attitudes towards women. We know often as Sikhs we're very quick to tell people about how we have gender equality in our religious doctrines. If we talk to our Muslim brothers and sisters, they'll tell us that the Islamic world actually granted rights to women that the Western world has only really given in the last 40 to 50 years. Women have been attending universities in the Islamic world since the 12th to 13th century AD. And much of the subjugation of women which actually happens in the Islamic world is more a cultural phenomenon than as a result of religion. The Christian world has not really had a history of subjugation of women from a religious point of view. Much of that has continued, or if there has been any subjugation, it's been cultural, legal, socio-economic in the Western world largely. You may or may not be surprised to hear that the answer to this question is actually Sikhs. There's a lot of introspection that's needed here for those of us who are listening to this talk. Because we are so quick to tell other people about gender equality in Sikhism. We're so quick to tell people about how unique that is in India. For some reason, it's not actually anything which translates onto the ground. It's not something which translates into attitudes towards the birth of girl children. And there are likely to be a number of reasons for this. I'll leave you to think about these, to read about them, and to hypothesize about these. But it's definitely something which needs to be addressed and to come out into the open if we're going to try and answer this question of how to fix Punjab's and as a broader ratio, sort of India's and Punjabis all over the world gender ratio. This was Ajit Singh, the author of selective.com, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with. He does some fantastic work dressing up as Captain America in the States, walking around with Captain America with the only addition being a buggy in place of a helmet. And he captures this sentiment quite well. Statistically, 274 girls will die in Punjab every day before they are born. And this gentleman here captures that really well by saying that I survived Punjab, but most sisters did not. Every day. Just think about that for a moment. we're looking at almost 2,000 a week. You're looking at almost 8,000 a month, and that's close to 100,000 per year. Just get some perspective on that. That's about the same as the total number of people who die on India's roads every year. If you want even more perspective, since the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, in a country that's been in a widely recognized civil war, there have been 150,000 documented violent civilian deaths since 2003. We have 100,000 girls dying in Punjab every year before they're born. Time to move on from some of these underlying causes, and I must make a note here that of course this isn't an exhaustive list. There are numerous others that could have been added here, and I'll leave you to think about. In the interest of time, they've been left out. Let's move on to talk about some of the direct causes which occur as a result of the attitudes fostered by these underlying causes. Now, some of the direct causes that we won't be spending all that much time on, or that we've already sort of covered, include the neglect of girls. We know that young girls in Punjab are less likely to receive the attention and care that they need. It's not unusual for them to eat last during the main meals of the day in rural Punjab and in India. When they are sick, they are less likely to receive the medical attention that they need. And all of this is reflected in the higher childhood mortality rate, which we see for young girls in Punjab. The other practice is that of infanticide, i.e. killing girls after birth. And once again, this is an old practice. It's been documented by the British for quite a substantial period of time, and it's that common that it's been considered a part of the traditional role of the dai or the midwife. Another direct cause, which we'll only really cover in passing here, is the issue of partition. Now it's in brackets here because it's a difficult phenomenon to study. It's known that in villages all over Indian and Pakistani Punjab, i.e. Chadda and Lenda Punjab, that relatives would often encourage females to commit suicide to complete the murder themselves to try and preserve the honour of the family and prevent rape at the time of partition. It's difficult to put a figure on exactly how prevalent this was, and much of the evidence that we have is anecdotal, and I encourage everyone to check out the video archives on YouTube with interviews of individuals who were affected by partition, which is quite eye-opening. This period is thought to have had a significant effect on the gender ratio in Punjab, but in the absence of accurate record keeping at the time, it's difficult to confirm, and I can't give you any more information than that. Of course, the main cause of which we're all aware is that of female feticide. It's the term given to the abortion of a female fetus after which gender has been determined during pregnancy. Antenatal testing, i.e. testing during pregnancy, actually became available in India in the 1980s, and it very quickly found a use for gender determination and subsequent abortion of female fetuses. Of course, this isn't what it's actually designed to be used for. Most of the time, these techniques involve taking a sample of amniotic fluid or tissue in the pregnancy to try and determine if there are any genetic abnormalities. But of course, while that is happening, it's also possible to determine whether the fetus is XX or female, or XY or male on the sex chromosome, and relay this information to the parents, whether blatantly, very obviously, or in more subtle ways. It's really difficult to complete a study where one goes around trying to ask obstetricians and gynecologists and to try and determine whether they engage in sex-selective abortions or not. Not many people will volunteer such incriminating information. The only study that we really have comes from 1986 in Mumbai. Now at the time the study completed showed that 64% of gynecologists and obstetricians in that city were using amniocentesis, which is one such antenatal test, or gender determination. In less than 10% of the total cases where amniocentesis was used, it was used for testing for genetic abnormalities, which is its intended purpose. In less than 10% of total cases. That means in over 90% of cases where amniocentesis is being used, it is being used purely for the purpose of gender determination, not what it is designed for. All the evidence from large studies into this topic, and the largest one that we have actually is one from the Lancet again. The fact that it's that good because it actually has a sample size of 1.1 million households, which they surveyed all throughout India. And this showed that from Punjab, gender determination and sex-selective abortion is more likely to occur in a household which already has a firstborn female. It's also more likely to occur in households with increasing monthly incomes just because they have more access to such technologies and are able to afford what we're talking about. You might or might not be interested to hear that it's actually illegal to abort a fetus based on sex in India, particularly when it is picked up on prenatal diagnostic techniques which are designed for other purposes. As of 2003, it's a crime punishable in court to try and seek out an abortion based on gender. Unfortunately, as with all things legal in India, this law is ineffective, it's poorly policed, and at the best of times, it's used to get back at people in petty revenge situations. So, of course, the question here is exactly how many fetuses in India are being aborted based on gender. And there are a number of differing estimates, but for India, the figure is said to be in the vicinity of 0.5 million a year. And once again, this comes from the largest study that we have on this topic, a survey of 1.1 million households. It's difficult to see how we can get a study with a bigger sample size than 1.1 million households. It's likely that this figure is a pretty good estimate, though most people agree that it's actually a conservative estimate and the figure may be much more than this due to underreporting. Now, we already know that 100,000 of these 500,000 of fetuses being aborted might actually be coming from Punjab. So along with drug and alcohol consumption per capita, sex-selective abortion is another arena where Punjab punches above its weight. If we look beyond Punjab, the UN actually has an estimate for the total number of women who are missing in the last 20 to 30 years all throughout the world. And by missing, I mean these are women who should be alive today and contributing to society but have been denied this chance due to life denied as a result of sex-selective abortions. And that figure is said to be in the vicinity of 25 to 40 million. And the vast majority of these women who are missing or have been denied the chance to life are likely to have come from India, China, some select countries of the Middle East, Africa. I could try and summarize exactly where we're up to right now, but in the presentation itself, it was easier to get you guys to do this for me. I would have liked a volunteer to read this file for me, but in this case, I'll read it out for yourselves. The English translation is right here. So, Kuria. Balk Saranavaniya, Tepanche Kataman, Rurihane Kuria. Dalara di Chakachaon, which anyway, one on the Korean Diachonia, Kikara de Baram Mudana. Mana Patani Paranti Nabuba, Sare hi Rishte, Kuria Tobi Amdene. Fervi Sadia Togo Shirihane, Una Via Mat Michika. Jasmi Hoy Apela Virla Pakatia. Tarma te Sadia Charane, Una da Apa Taba Karan Vich, Ui Kasar Nahi Chadi. ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਜੰਗਲ ਅਤੇ ਗਵਾਰ ਕਿਹਾ, ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਗੁੱਟ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮੱਤ ਕਹੀ, ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕੁੜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮੱਤ, ਹਨੇਰੇ ਰਾਹਾਂ 'ਚ ਦੀਵੇ ਜਗਾਉਣ ਕੋਈ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਏਗਾ, ਰਾਹਾਂ 'ਚ ਵਿਛੀਆਂ ਕੱਚ ਦੀਆਂ ਕਿੰਕਰਾਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਚੁਗਣੀਆਂ, ਮਨ ਜਾਂ ਜਿਸਮ ਦੇ ਜ਼ਖਮਾਂ ਤੇ ਮੱਲਮ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਲਗਾਣੀ, ਮਖੌਤਿਆਂ ਤੇ ਆਰ ਪਾਰ ਦੇਖਣ ਦੀ ਜਾਂਚ खुद ही सिखनी पैनी है, अपने राहां नूं रचनाउण लई अपने हत्थां दी मिसाल खुद ही फड़नी पैनी है. Now just focus your attention on those last three lines again. अपने राहां नूं रचनाउण लई अपने हत्थां च मिसाल खुद ही फड़नी पैनी है. And I'm sure that's the reason why most of you are actually listening to this talk today. You'd like to know about what can be done to try and fix this problem and the sort of initiatives that you can take, and hopefully by the end of it you'll have some more thinking going on in your head. You'll have some ideas which are popping out which you can bring to the table to try and solve this problem, not just in India, but in Punjabi communities and in whichever small corner of the world that you might actually be listening from. Now we have a good idea of what's actually happening in Punjab. It's time to pose a bigger question. Is it possible for sex-selective abortion to migrate, to cross borders, and to become prevalent in countries with big Indian population? The short answer to this is yes, but of course you aren't listening to this because you want the short answer. You want the long answer. The first country to consider is Canada. The natural ratio of births in Canada is 1.05 males being born for every female. And you might think that surely people who migrate overseas, who leave the developing world behind because they're sick of the system, they're sick of the lack of law, the power of the rich, the subjugation of the poor, surely these people would not practice the same discriminatory practices that we would expect to see in their country of origin. Now, if you haven't already sensed the sarcasm in my voice, I'm going to give you the figures. The Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese population in Canada have a ratio of about 1.4 males being born for every female. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, then the situation in the Indian community is even more shocking. The rate of male-to-female births in the Indian community is about 1.9 males to every female. There are almost twice as many males being born as females in Canada in the Indian community, and I think we all know that Punjabis form a significant portion of that Indian community. It's difficult to see how this sort of a ratio can come about through natural variation, and I think there's widespread agreement that sex-selective abortion is being carried out. As to exactly how this is happening, is it the result of a few road doctors themselves, or is it that people are actually moving back to India or having little trips to India to have it done? It's difficult to confirm. The issue here is that Canada is trying to grapple with how to solve this problem and how to promote gender equality and well-being for all. Over the last 20 or so years, it's actually become a significant problem for health authorities in Canada. And one of the solutions that they're actually contemplating is banning the disclosure of fetal gender prior to 30 weeks, after which abortion becomes decidedly more technically and legally difficult. If we turn our attention to the UK, once again, the natural ratio is about 1.05 male children to every female child. The sex ratio in the Indian-born community has become more and more biased towards male births. It's not as skewed as Canada, but it's definitely altered in a way not explainable by natural coincidence. It must be noted that this data is from women who already have 2 or more previous children, and it's likely that these 2 or more previous children may be female, and hence they're now pursuing sex-selective abortion. What's interesting also is that the number of births is declining, the declining fertility rates. And on top of that, it should also be noted that much of this information often comes from PhD candidates, an aspect and a source of information that we're actually lacking here in Australia. Now, the last slice of the picture that we're going to paint actually comes from Australian data, from some ABS statistics, which were retrieved and analysed by SBS Australia and a few demographers earlier this year. The results are concerning. Now, we know that compared to the UK and Canada, the Indian and Punjabi community in Australia is in a much earlier stage of development. We don't have the number of generations that Canada and the UK have experienced, and in a way, Canada and the UK may actually represent a crystal ball for the Indian community here in Australia. So that's where this data actually gets even more concerning, in that if this practice is starting to happen, if this data suggests that the ratio is starting to skew, then exactly where it stops, how we stop it from happening, becomes the real question, because we don't want to reach the sort of ratio that's seen in Canada, with 2 times as many males being born per female. In the Indian community here in Australia, the ratio has started to rise. It's risen to 108.2. In the Chinese community, it's hit 109.5, and this is a graphic representation of the same numbers. Now, expert opinion is that it's difficult to see how this sort of a pattern may appear just through natural variation. If we combine all of the religious and cultural and economic factors that we know and everything that's actually happening in India and China right now, it's very likely that these figures are as a result of sex-selective abortions. Exactly how this is happening practically is very difficult to understand, because of course it's illegal to try and pursue an abortion purely on the basis of gender in this country. How it might be happening, I'll leave you to decide, but the likely truth here is that it is happening. It needs to start being acknowledged if we're going to try and avoid the same demographic challenges faced by India, now Canada, the UK, countries with significant Indian populations, particularly as the community here in Australia grows. If we're really going to address this issue of sex-selective abortion in our community in Australia, as it grows and comes to prominence, we need to try and view it in the broader context of women's rights. And We don't need the wonderful ladies from groups such as the Sikh Women and Girls group here in Sydney to try and tell us how badly we are failing on that front. It's to the point that the state of Victoria is now contemplating a law to ban the practice of dowry. You might remember I mentioned the word introspection before, and here's probably another great time to use it. We really need to think about the direction where we are headed. Instead of drawing positive media coverage, we have articles here explaining how we manage to nurture, to foster, and to bring a centuries-old demeaning marriage practice into the 21st century, yet we can't nurture, foster, and bring a girl into this world. Just think about that for a moment. The big question is, how are we going to address this problem? And I'm sure you have noticed, up until now, I've tried to be as objective as possible. I've tried to leave the collective frustrations of our generation directed at our culture behind. But of course, there are two solutions to this. One is on the record, and one is off the record. And this presentation will cover both. I assume the people who will be listening to this are very demographic. I don't expect many of them to be health professionals. I expect most of them to be Punjabis or Indians who have a vested interest in this topic because they want to try and fix this problem. So for that reason, we'll start with the on-the-record answer first. Now, it's not easy. It doesn't take very long to actually go through because, of course, there is no clear answer. Canada continues to grapple with the issue of sex-selective abortions and how to fix it. It's yet to come up with a conclusive solution. The US, with their Indian population, the UK, face similar situation. South Korea is perhaps one example of a country which has effectively reversed its gender ratio problem. And much of this has been through social media campaigns, such as the I Love Your Daughters campaign, which became quite popular on televised media, radio media, and social media in South Korea. And the country with quite widespread internet access was very effective and permeated across all aspects of society. And I think you can still find evidence of on YouTube, plenty of different ads out there to have a look at. India, on the other hand, has been unable to mount an effective government response to this situation. The focus of the response has been through non-government organisation, public health drive. Facilities for girls have been promised in the form of education and healthcare but never delivered. The same social media efforts have also been trialled in India. I think we've all heard about the anti-dowry pledge and the selfie with your daughter, organised by Narendra Modi himself, but in a country where only a quarter of the population actually has access to internet, it's difficult to see how this will achieve the broad, sweeping change necessary. Although that's not to say that social media doesn't have a role. Of course, this sort of a tweet came out from a lady in India themselves. It just needs to be a part of a larger, more viable solution in changing the perception of women in India. Otherwise, as this tweet points out, a cow is more likely to receive police attention and government attention to their plight than a woman is on the streets of New Delhi. That's enough of the official talk, because if we're going to truly address this problem, even in a country with a relatively small Indian and Punjabi population such as Australia, we need to talk off the record. We need to get over the diplomatic niceties and get to the core of what's actually contributing to it. And from a Punjabi point of view, we have a fantastic culture. It's something to be proud of. But I don't think I need to reference a journal article here when I say that we are so caught up in the pride of our culture that we can't see what's wrong with it. We can't see that it's contributing to dowry, honour killings. Our marriage practices result in the subjugation of women, and they foster a culture where it is okay to commit acts of domestic violence or seek further dowry if one is not happy after marriage. We can't see that we are indirectly killing off our next generation of girls. And of course, we don't need the representatives from SWAG or Sikh Women and Girls Group in Sydney to tell us how far behind the 8 ball that we are. Issues of women's health and rights are coming forward in the wrong ways. We're hearing about them in the Daily Telegraph rather than in community forums. And the tragic thing is, I'm sure you'll all agree, that the most resistance that groups such as SWAG actually experience to their work is from prominent faces of our own community here in Sydney, who feel that in some way empowering women may actually alter their own house setup, change the way that the women behave at home, they're threatened by what that might actually bring. And this needs to change. We need progressive leadership on this issue. We need women to be aware of what their rights are in a country such as Australia. Otherwise, tragic cases of domestic violence leading to death, such as that of Mrs. Balinda Kaur here in Brownsville in Sydney, or Sogan Ragi from Melbourne, which you can have a read about here, will continue to emerge. Ultimately, we need to address the underlying contributing factors which affect the health and lives of women in our own community, and it's only then that these practices will actually truly abate. We can try and legislate as much as we want to try and improve the gender ratio, but if there's one lesson from today, it's that that will only go so far. How can we, as individuals, start some cultural shifts? And it's not hard. If you are fortunate enough to have a sister, you don't need me to tell you how much you should appreciate that bond. And for those of us who are not so fortunate, an aspect of our beautiful culture that's often forgotten by Punjabi singers in their cheap money-making scams disguised as songs is that every girl at the same age of you is your sister. Those who are younger than you are your daughters, and those who are older than you are just like your mothers. And once we bring that respect back into our relationships, the gender ratio will flip in itself. Now, those of you listening might actually think I'm only talking to the guys in the audience today. That's actually untrue. Because, of course, the decision to go through with a sex-selective abortion belongs to the mother themselves. The coercion for that sex-selective abortion to happen, in a vast majority of cases, comes from the mother-in-law. I'm not placing blame on women for this practice. Please don't misinterpret what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying is it's an issue for both genders, however ironic or however sort of silly that might actually feel. We as a community need to start putting in place a more formalized structure once we've actually addressed the way that we behave in our own households. We need to try and address the issue in what is effectively its primacy in Australia, and ensure that it doesn't grow with the growth of the Indian community. One way of approaching it is to structure ourselves around formalized health frameworks, and one that's quite commonly mentioned when discussing public health policy is that of the Ottawa Health Charter. In order to devise effective policies and approaches to try and address problems, there are certain domains to try and address. We've already begun to address some of these, and in others we're lacking. Firstly, we need to work on our ability to enable, to mediate, and to advocate for women in our community. And as part of this, we can't keep relying on anecdotal data. We need some quality quantitative and qualitative data on exactly how prevalent sex-selective abortions are, what the prevailing community attitude is, and how it fits with other issues of women's rights. And the best way to do this is through PhD candidates tackling this topic. Now, quite a few people who are listening to this talk today might actually find themselves approaching stages in their lives over the next few years where they're thinking about further work. And if you're prepared to do some heavy academic lifting, then this topic is something to consider. On top of that, we need some advocacy, and that's in the form of organisations tackling this issue, such as SWAG, or Sick Women and Girls Group. Once we've sorted ourselves out and we know more about the problem, we need to reorient health services to make them work in accordance with the nature of the problem. We need local health groups to know about the issues of women's rights, feticide, influencing factors in the Punjabi community, and we need them to be friendly and approachable when women have issues. We need to strengthen community action and develop personal skills. Women need to be empowered to seek help when needed, and how to do this is the difficulty. Finally, we need some supportive environments. The Sick Helpline here in Sydney is a step in the right direction, and I encourage you all to volunteer with them if you get time. It allows women and other individuals in our community to seek some confidential and non-judgmental help over the phone when needed. Health services need to be welcoming, and community supports need to be non-judgmental, and that's an area, along with the empowerment of women, where we are really struggling. Women need to be able to approach help in our own community and not be judged for whatever is happening in their household. Their vulnerability needs to be accepted until it's been proven otherwise. That's an area that's going to need some work, and something I'll leave you to think about and to discuss as you walk away from this. Hopefully inspired to bring something to the table, and ultimately this topic is bigger than me, with a single PowerPoint and a mouse pointer disguised as a laser pointer. It requires the collective community effort of our community to try and nip it in the bud and to ensure the well-being and the health of all in our community. The generation above us, I'm talking as a 23-year-old, have done some excellent work, but we all need to recognise that in those of us who have actually grown up here in Australia or in Canada or in the UK, we've got some very unique skills. Whether we approach this issue from a health point of view, from a legal point of view, a political economy or a socio-economic point of view, there's a lot we can do once we get the wheels in motion. With that, I want to leave you on that positive note. I want to leave you to think about what that means for you and the sort of things you can bring to the table. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this talk. I especially want to thank representatives from the Sikh Women and Girls Group who expressed their positive intentions and their positive desire to get behind any initiatives associated with this, and the Sikh Helpline who did some fantastic work. In the actual presentation, we have time for some great questions and discussion at this point, and that's why I encourage you all to come to the next presentation so you get an idea of what that discussion entails when I'm sort of about half an hour after the talk. If anybody who's listened to the talk today wants to ask any questions or would like to request any further information, please just find us on Facebook at Ithaas, ITHAAS, and just send us a message. This talk has been converted into a webinar and uploaded to Facebook and YouTube based on the original presentation that was done on Friday the 13th. If you haven't already liked us on Facebook, please do. I look forward to seeing you at the next talk. If anybody has any ideas for the talks or any feedback to give on this talk, or even better, would actually like to deliver a talk, it's a fantastic way of building some public speaking skills. Please do get in touch with us. But otherwise, that's all from me for tonight. I look forward to hearing from you in the future.